Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 12 o'clock event. I am so pleased to see so many of you here. I am Lisa Milton. I am a prima donna. I love saying that. I am a prima donna. And I am not Emma DeBeery. I'm really sorry. Emma cannot make it. So I'm stepping in to interview Nikesh Shukla, who is a hugely important, influential ally and an amazing author who has changed British publishing. So I'm really excited. He's looking at me like I'm a weirdo. He has. Nikesh is an incredible writer, an incredible human being who has spent the last decade really delivering massive change in publishing, which is, as you know, an area of society that needs to really move into the 21st century. And Nikesh has been making really positive changes and a lot of effort for a very long time. We're going to talk a little bit about that and about allyship and what that looks like and what has happened and what we can do. But also he's going to talk about his latest book, Brown Baby, and he will do a reading from that for us, which I'm really excited to hear. We will be able to take questions if you want them. Nikesh isn't very keen. I've said we should keep it open just in case. I shouldn't say that. But I am aware it's quite hard in the big stage. So, but if you do have questions, please do let us know. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Nikesh Shukla, author and editor extraordinaire. Nikesh. I'm going to start by being pretty general and asking you to tell us a little bit about how you started. When did you start writing and why, and how did that happen?
Yeah, so I spent my 20s as a very average rapper, and which rap fans will know, no one wants an average rapper. You either, because a lot of the lyrics involve a sense of bravado, so you either need to be brilliant because you're going to have to remind everyone lyrically how brilliant you are, or if you're not great, you have to have like a thing about you, like ODB, which is a controversial rap take of mine. We can beef about it afterwards. And I was just average. I just didn't have like the meticulousness that musicians need to kind of get better. But I was always very invested in storytelling, and I was always writing short stories while I was doing the raps. And I kind of fell in with this amazing spoken word scene that was being spearheaded by an amazing writer called Nee Parks and a bunch of other people. And Nee and Corche Newland, another who was a huge influence of mine, a huge hero of mine, were putting together an anthology called Tell Tales. And the first volume came out, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then for the second volume, they had open submissions. And so I decided to submit a short story. And this is kind of where my voice formed, because like in my student days, I did a lot of student activism. I worked on a lot of miscarriage of justice campaigns and was helping lots of anti-racism organisations. And there was this young man called Zahid Mubarak who, when he was 16 years old, he stole some razor blades and was sent to Feltham Young Offenders Institute. And the Feltham Young Offenders Institute has always had really, really serious problems with its guards, with racism, with a lot of how those kids are treated. And they put Zahid in a cell with a known racist, and the night before Zahid was due to be released, he was beaten to death. And that story really stayed with me. But what really, really stayed with me was the image of Zahid, and how that image became symbolic of a miscarriage of justice, and how that image was used to tell the story of state injustice. And the thing that was always missing for me, and the thing that was always missing from how we talked about Stephen Lawrence, was I always wanted to, it felt like their lives had been lost and their lives had been wasted, and they never got to like, I don't know, be in their 20s and like have a misspent youth and like settle down, or like not settle down, or whatever their lives had just they had gone, and their images were used as examples of horrific things. And so I wrote this short story trying to give Zahid some humanity. So I imagined what his final thoughts must have been, or what he might have been thinking about. And I wrote this short story and I sent it in, and it got accepted into this anthology, which was really, really amazing. And then Courtier and Rajiv edited me, and it was the first time I'd ever been edited. And it was the first time I sort of noticed the difference between me as a rapper and me as a writer, because whenever people like gave me feedback on the raps, if they weren't if they were less than complimentary, I got really defensive about it. But the editing process, something I seemed to really enjoy, and it made me want to get better, and that was interesting to me. That made me think, well, maybe this is where I need to be more at. And I'm still incredibly proud of that short story. And then the anthology arrived, and it had a barcode on the back of it, which was amazing. Like that meant it was legit. You could buy it in shops and pay $9.99 and get your penny change and have this thing, and it had been scanned. And then I saw the contents list, and I was there next to Courtier Newland. I was in the same book as Courtier Newland, and I was in the same book as Ramesh Gunasekara and Leonie Ross and Kamala Shamsi and Gemma Weeks and all these amazing people. And I never thought that I was their peer, but I thought, wow, I'm good enough to be in the same book as them. And after that, I was off to the races. I was like, okay, let's write a novel now. And 3 attempts later, started the novel that would become my first published novel.
Tell us about the 3 attempts. What was that like?
Bad attempts, really bad attempts. Like the first novel, novel I tried to write became my 3rd novel, and I was always really hung up about this story in my family about my uncle. So my uncle, in 1968, became the first person to ever bring a case of racial discrimination under the Race Relations Act, which had just come in, and I was always really inspired by how he stood up and fought for his rights, even though everyone around him was telling him not to. And what bravery that took, and how one person can make a difference. And so when I tried to write about it, I was so hung up on the act and the event, that I just didn't have any story for it. I didn't have any characters. I just it was like this sort of, you know how like in Star Wars they refer to Han Solo doing the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs. Another nerd reference for you there, and everyone's like, wow, this thing of legend, this thing of myth, and then you watch the Solo film, and then you see him do the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs, and you're like, it's not that good. But like the myth was what I was trying to write to, and I just couldn't do it. I just fell under the weight of it, and so I kept trying to write that novel, and I had 2 goes at it, and gave up and wrote something else, and that's the novel that became my 3rd novel. But then, wrote what became my first novel, and then...
Which is called?
Coconut Unlimited. And then years later, I was randomly listening to a podcast interview with the guy who created Arrested Development, the sitcom, and he broke down structure in a way that I'd never thought about before, and it just unlocked something that meant that this book that I've been trying to write since I was 19 years old, suddenly I knew how to write it.
That's phenomenal that it was actually through a TV scriptwriter that you were able to see where your story needed to go and what you needed to do. That's pretty unusual.
Yeah, I think sometimes you hear, like, all these techniques are so hidden.
Yeah.
Either you have to know someone who works in the biz who can give you the experience you might need, or you can afford to do a creative writing course or creative writing MA, or even go to New York Film School. Actually, like podcast interviews with creatives have really democratized that knowledge. And so when Mitch Hurwitz said most sitcom is based around a family structure that started in Commedia dell'arte, where you have the matriarch, the patriarch, the craftsman and the clown, and you all give them something that they want, and then you put obstacles in their way. I was like, oh, that makes complete sense to me. Now I understand how characters work. And it unlocked something about this novel, and I was able to go away and write it.
Brilliant line, actually. I've never heard that before. I do need to go and listen to that, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you'll never be able to watch a sitcom again
in the same way.
Without going, well, that's the craftsman, that's the clown. It's a really interesting thing.
But there's supposedly only 7 plots to novels anyway. Have you heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I was joking about this yesterday, if anyone saw the mother tongue panel that we did, but I was talking about Kurt Vonnegut has this really good there's this really good YouTube video of Kurt Vonnegut talking about the shape of stories, and he draws a line like this, and he goes, man in a hole, man finds himself in a hole, and then digs through a series of obstacles, digs his way out, and finds himself better off for the opportunity. And I was like, wow, that is Western literature. in a nutshell. It's all like, you know, the way we teach creative writing in this country is so ingrained in like main characters' agency and choice dictating the flow of plot, and that's essentially Man in Hull.
Really is. And interestingly, when you were writing, when you were moving from having been published with your short story and then becoming a novelist, had you got a deal at that point, or were you writing without an editor and writing without an agent? Where were you at?
Goes a long time between that short story and my novel coming out, like 6 years or something. No, I didn't have a deal until the deal I signed for Coconut Limited. I didn't have an agent until about 4 months after Coconut Limited came out.
So you were unagented when you. That's incredible. And how did you get a deal? What did you do?
Just very persistent.
You hustled. I love it.
But also, my advice would be get an agent because that contract is not a good contract.
Oh, isn't it?
No. And the thing was that, you know, I was offered this deal. I took some advice from the amazing Society of Authors, offered me free advice on the contract, and they were like, these things are a bit dodge. But the thing about having that advice is like, you still don't have negotiating power, like, because I kept thinking, oh, they might take this away from me if I push back on some of these things. And so I was literally just cutting and pasting an email and sending it to them and going, taking some advice, and this is what they recommend. And the publisher was like, no, we're not changing it. And I didn't have any leverage. So I ended up signing not a great deal.
Yeah. And you did have leverage, but you just didn't realise it.
I didn't know I did.
I would totally advocate for an agent, always. I think it makes such a difference to have that person to get you. But also, it's just the advice piece, isn't it, as you kind of move along. Now, I'm very aware we're not talking about what we're kind of down to talk about in terms of allyship and Brown Baby. So I'd like to sort of move on a little bit. And when you published Coconut Unlimited, that was indeed shortlisted, wasn't it, for the Costa First Novel Award. But I think when you arrived in the world of publishing, you saw a world that you didn't really recognise, and the world you saw perhaps wasn't one that reflected what you thought it might be. How was that for you, becoming a published author and arriving in...
Yeah, I mean, it was a weird thing to kind of be published in a year where there was like fewer than 10 writers of colour being published that year. And it just felt sort of weird and lonely. Because I knew lots of writers, I knew lots of really talented individuals, but they just weren't being published, and so you kind of like I don't necessarily think that it was a case of like. No, I think sorry, I'll take that again. It just felt like the disconnect between who I knew was out there and who was being published felt wrong.
Yeah, and when you saw that, I know, because I've known you for some time, that you decided you wanted to change what you could see and be part of driving the change in publishing. So,
well, no, I didn't.
You didn't?
No, I just wanted to be a writer. That's all I've ever wanted to do. Like the pressure on artists of colour or artists from marginalised groups across industries to also do lots of advocacy work that their white counterparts don't do or signal boost just puts a lot of pressure on them to like. I often think like if I'd been given the time I had, because I had a full-time job at the time, so I only had a certain amount of time to do the publishing bit. But if I'd devoted all of that to writing, where could I be now? What career could I have had? Like because no one really noticed what I was doing until The Good Immigrant came around, right? So if I'd had the fullness of my capabilities to just use that time to write, like who could I be as an artist? How would I have developed? What would my career have looked like? But instead you kind of go, okay, I've got a full-time job and I've got like 45 minutes a day to write and also to push back on a bunch of stuff. And also like the mental toll that pushing back on a bunch of stuff takes. Because like you're sort of scared because you're going to ruffle some feathers, you're going to upset some people, you're going to burn some bridges, and you're then going to be walking on eggshells every time you walk into any room. And so no, I didn't want to do any of that. I just wanted to be a comedy writer. I just wanted to write sitcoms. I just wanted to write books that made people laugh. I didn't want to like sit here and go, oh, racism's bad, surely we know it by now, So yeah, like it wasn't the part of my job I was interested in. But the thing is, once you have a platform and you realise that people are listening to you, you realise that you have that responsibility, and so you do that work in the hope that other people will come through and they will gain a platform and they'll also be able to do that work and all the rest of it. But for the longest time, it felt lonely. Like, what's great now, like 6 or 7 years later, after like doing all this speaking out, is I'm far from the only one doing it. And even then, I was far from the only one doing it. I was just probably the loudest on Twitter.
Yeah, and I think you had a bigger platform because of what you were achieving and what you'd achieved. And I didn't know any of that because obviously, as you know, 5.5 years ago, I called you up and said, I'm thinking of setting up a new imprint and would love to talk to you about it. So were lots of people doing the same thing and coming to you essentially for free advice?
Yeah, and like it takes time, and like these were the years that I was a youth worker as well with a young kid. And the thing about being a youth worker is that is not a job that you leave at 5 p.m. It's a job that follows you into the night, follows you into your weekends, especially if you're a diligent youth worker. So like it was just a lot of stuff, and a lot of not writing, and a lot of not having the career I wanted to have.
Yeah, and a lot of making other people's dreams come true. Because with Good Immigrant, which we should talk about, you created something where you created a space for other people to be published in a way that you hadn't seen. So now we do know that in UK publishing there are some really phenomenal authors that were given their first platform by you in The Good Immigrant. Does that ever sort of marry up and make it feel that it was kind of worthwhile? Or it's so hard when you're doing so much to actually take time to address and measure and understand.
Yeah, but the thing I think about The Good Immigrant is I don't think it was an individual effort on my part. Like, I don't like being centred in that story. And what was really, really awesome about seeing Sophie and Sharon and Sana talk about collectives, it reminded me of the collective that formed around The Good Immigrant. Like, we were all a family, we were all a crew. We were like the last gang in town, you know, like, and there was just something really wonderful about that. We all had our individual identities and our own individual artistic perspectives and dreams and all the rest of it. But this one thing brought us together, and it felt powerful to be part of that, but also know that like it was an entirely like organic thing.
And did it become bigger than you expected it to be then?
Yeah, I thought we'd sell like 500 copies and it would just be a thing that I did. But
and you sold?
Like hundreds of thousands of copies. We're doing like...
And a bestseller in America and a bestseller in the UK.
Yeah, like we're doing like a special 5th anniversary edition this year, which is really cool. Yeah, like it blew up. But like there's an interesting thing that kind of happened when it blew up, which was like... I am not, Emma Darbury should be here, and like she is an amazing academic who is like, done all this amazing work. Her new book is such an incredible book about all these issues. Like, as I said before, like I'm not like trying to be all fake humble about it. Like, I am a comedy writer. That's what I always wanted to do. Can you tell I'm hilarious? So like then going from being a comedy writer to like then being expected to tour the country and talk about racism for a living was just a really weird thing to happen, and also like not something that I planned to do, and actually like touring that book was like it wasn't the best experience because you'd rock up in a town with the contributors, we'd do events, and because I had a young kid, I would always leave so I could be home in time for their breakfast. If I was missing bedtime, my rule was if I could, I had to be there for breakfast. And the other contributors would stay in town and decompress and like have a couple of drinks, and they'd have that time together to reset after these events. And so I was always just sitting with like the horror of like sitting on a panel talking about racism, having someone in the audience in the Q&A like share their stories and hold that, and then someone else in the audience go stand up and then like go, I think what you're talking about is a load of nonsense, and then then we have to have that back and forth, and it was a tense time. Like there was this thing called like Brexit, there was Trump, there was so many things that were happening in those years, and it was a really tough time. I don't think I was at my best mentally then. And then when touring stopped, I just crashed. I just completely crashed. And yeah, I mean, I write about it in the book. Like I developed a really unhealthy relationship with food, and like having to also then try to talk to my kids about mental health issues and what was triggering them and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's really hard when your kid's 4 and you're like, yeah, so I had to do an event about racism, and then I got shouted at, and then the person followed me out the door, continued shouting at me, and then they bought a book, and then then shouted at me, and then reminded me, like, all of this sort of stuff. Like, it was, so like all of this stuff is, like, it's interesting that we're talking about allyship, because part of allyship, I think, is sort of recognizing where you hold power and influence and what good you can do, but also recognizing that the sort of the unfair burdens that people often take on in sort of trying to do this work. And I think for me, it just sort of wildly went beyond the boundaries of what I found was comfortable. So like all my work energy that I wanted to do in those years was I'm in the process of going back to youth work, because I've had a couple of years out of it now to do some writing stuff, but I'm going back to youth work in September, because that's the work I want to do. That's where I think I'm most useful, and that's where I think I do the most good. Like, talking on panels isn't, like, about racism isn't my forte, amazingly. So like, yeah.
I think you're incredibly compelling talking about these things, and I think we need to learn from your experience of the fact that you have spent so much time in a role that you weren't expecting to do. From coming from a great place of wanting to make a difference and create change, you found yourself in an industry and a world that really needed you, but that then actually took so much more from you. And I think that's what we're trying to do with Primadonna, is trying to create a space where we can have these really important conversations about who we are and what we can do and how we can make, I mean, what we're saying here is, how do we make the world as it should be? If only for one weekend. And I guess I'd like to ask you that question, Nikesh, because, and then we'll come on to Brown Baby, but obviously you've had all that experience. You've now created this phenomenal situation for many, many authors who now have got book deals and they've got books coming out. So they wouldn't probably have had those opportunities without The Good Immigrant, or they might have had them, but not so soon. How can we take that learning and build on it for a future, but for the next generation of writers?
I mean, I don't feel like I'm responsible for that stuff, but if there's one thing I could recommend that everyone can do today, or when you next get Wi-Fi, if you've got data issues, is so the amazing writer Reniero Lodge, who wrote Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, did a companion podcast series. It's a six or eight episode podcast series that followed it, and it's incredible. And the final episode is her answering the question, how can I be a good ally? And she kind of turns the question on its head in a really interesting way. I won't spoil it for you, because I would be paraphrasing it in an awful way, and actually the way she deconstructs the question itself is brilliant. And so I really recommend. It's I can't remember how many episodes it is, but it's definitely the final episode in that podcast series, and it's available on wherever you get your podcasts. So I would really recommend downloading that and listening to that if you're interested in the issues around allyship.
I'm also publishing a book by Nova Reid called The Good Ally, and I don't know if you know Nova, called The Good Ally. We're publishing it in September. She too has got a brilliant podcast in a similar way, where she really makes the listener, and will make the reader, think about what actually the real questions are and what the real actions are. I know it's really uncomfortable for you, Nikesh, but I am so very grateful for you for sharing that with us, because we do need to learn and move on, and we do need to understand what it has been like for people like yourself who have been leading this very important change in publishing. And I know that writing Brown Baby probably was not very easy at all to do, but again, the reason you wrote the book is because you could see that there weren't stories like yours being shared. And I know that it's been a really interesting experience for you, hasn't it, publishing non-fiction as opposed to fiction. And I'd love to understand how that's been for you. And then I'd really like you to tell us a little bit and read from Brown Baby if you are willing to do so.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, like moving, like there was a voice I experimented with in my essay in The Good Immigrant, kind of inspired by James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates' epistolary writings to their future generations. And I really liked that voice. And then I read Dear Girls by Ali Wong, which is hilarious. And I thought there's more to do in this voice. And I just had this... So the reason I wrote the book was I just had this question that I was just turning over in my head as a parent. And I didn't know how to necessarily approach it in a fiction way. But the question... forgive me if you were at the motherhood panel yesterday, because it's a similar thing, but the question is pretty much, how do we raise our kids to be joyful and boundless in a world that seems so bleak that I feel so sad and angry about? And the book is kind of an interrogation of that. And the like moving into non-fiction was really interesting because I got to employ all of my storytelling techniques and tricks and tips that I've kind of built up over the years, and use this voice to, I guess, like, my fiction has always been very emotionally truthful, but now that emotional truth had to stand next to like an actual truth or a physical truth, which is a kind of an interesting thing, because I hadn't really considered until writing a memoir that memoir is imperfect, and memoir is, I mean, it's the things that you're left with. Like, Hilary Mantel has this wonderful way of describing historical fiction when she's like, it's what's left in the sieve after you've run it through the years. And that's to me is what memoir feels like sometimes.
And it's so imperfect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you know it's your truth in that moment,
Yeah.
and it might not be at all.
And your truth changes over the years. So, like,
Yeah.
when I think back to a conversation I had 4 years ago, I haven't necessarily remembered it or internalized it in the way that I experienced it in the moment. And also, what do I really remember of what was said? And so even like having scenes of of conversation, of dialogue between two people, especially between me and a 4-year-old child, it is imperfect because, you know, it's what I'm remembering. It's this like the energy of what I'm remembering rather than like the specificity of what was actually said. And I think you can, when you're first starting out, you can get so hung up on and then this happened and this happened and this happened, the preciseness of how you remember a thing, and you forget that truth and perspective of the things that people are reading it for.
Do you keep a diary?
No, this year I was gifted a really beautiful. So just tell. I don't know why I'm telling this story. It's a boring story, but you're here, and I've forgotten how to do live events.
Brilliant.
So one of my contributors to The Good Immigrant and me, Shimen, like, we had this really magical moment where we were doing an event at London Literature Festival for The Good Immigrant, and we were both just really overwhelmed at it, and I just leaned over to her while Coco was reading, and I just said, "We did a good thing," and it became a mantra for us, like, we did a good thing, and like that thing that we did was a good thing, and we kept saying it, and we were both gifted notebooks when The Good Immigrant USA came out, where someone had engraved on them, "We did a good thing," and it was a really special thing for me, and so I don't have a diary, but I've forced myself to every day to write down seven joyful images from the day, and so I have a collection of joyful images of each day, and I can like go back and like try and remember what they refer to, and that's the closest I have to a diary at the moment.
That's amazing. When you say images, is that sort of
Well,
photos
I mean, today
or
it'll be
words
looking out from the main stage and seeing loads and loads of people instead of like a quiet Zoom where you can't hear people like fiddle with their water bottles and like shuffle about and all the rest of it. It's so joyful to see you, and I just want to say thank you. Like, it's such a like big decision at the moment, like where you go and like where you spend your time outside of your house. So thanks so much for coming out to this festival. It like means the world to all of the writers who've like been on various stages, and like, because it's been weird doing Zoom events for the last year and a half, because everyone else is on mute except you and the person you're talking to, and it just feels weird. So this is so nice.
It's lovely. I forgot. Yes. That's nice. I've forgotten how to be. I keep not looking at the audience. We're making eye contact. It's like, where's the screen? How does it? It's so strange to be in person and very happy making. I feel like we're topping up on what it's like to be human and remembering all those brilliant things. Nikesh, will you read a little bit from Brown Baby for us, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll just read from the start. I never considered becoming a parent myself until my mum died. I'd like to think there was a moment where the switch flicked on, or the force field came down, or the upgrade happened between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. plugged into a power source, Wi-Fi switched on. It was nothing like that. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no tearful staring out over a field of bluebells, no Proustian cake-chewing revelation, and no need to cement my legacy. You didn't appear to me in a dream. I didn't read a saccharine poem about inheritance. I didn't hold a friend's baby and have the big final chorus of Barry Manilow's "Looks Like We Made It" erupt in my head. You just arrived. 1 minute your mum and I were getting drunk at Christmas, and there you were, in my arms, asleep. Your clenched fists covering your face much like they did on the ultrasound. Your nails were long, your eyes were closed. You looked just like her, just like my mum. Maybe it was a trick of my imagination or some sort of sleep-deprived, adrenaline-fueled tether to bring you into the family. Maybe you just sort of look like mum in the way babies and old people are indistinguishably vole-like in certain lights. I tried to capture it on my camera, but you know how photographs capture moments and never the narratives that prescribe them. Some photographs lack intent, others capture fragments, and only you can zero in on the history of that moment. Everyone else can just see the vole baby with her claws over her face. I look at it now, and that photo of you looks like you and not like her. My mind was playing tricks on me in those early moments, because when I first took in your face, all I saw was my mum. It was like she was alive again and I was whole. The quick camera phone photo I took when I checked it later on the toilet, because this was the only sanctum left. How wrong I was, I have no sanctum. In the maelstrom of your first day on earth, when I could justify looking at my phone, it looked nothing like what I thought I had captured. It looked like you and not like her. The photograph was of your face, a new entry, someone I'd not met before, someone I'd not seen before, someone I'd not met, a stranger. And yet when I walked back into the bedroom and saw you asleep on your back in your own mother's arms, the only light coming from the landing, I saw it again. I saw her in you. Were you her reborn? I shook the thought from my head. How could I project onto a baby, the blankest of canvases, my own grief? And when you cried, I took you in my arms and went into another room. I stood in the window and swayed from side to side. The curtains were open, and I looked out into the windows of the flats behind our house. The man with the beard was washing up, as he always seemed to do. In the room below him, two people I'd not seen before were holding onto a bowl, moving it in a slow, controlled, ceremonious circle. The guy who had his window open every single day, all year round, for unknown reasons that drove me crazy with speculation, had his window open. I say none of this so you think I'm a creep who spends his time staring into other people's homes. I say this so that you know in that moment, as I stared down at you, trying to take stock of the fact that my entire world had changed. Everything was on a new course. Everyone else around us was exactly as they should be. The world continued to turn and not move to the beat of just one drum, and that grounded me. It stopped me freaking out. And I'll leave it there.
You absolutely are amazing. I've got a lump in my throat. I've got a lump in my throat. I don't know how you feel. It's so brilliant. Nikesh is an incredible writer, as you know, and we'll be signing copies of Brown Baby in Waterstones when we finish the event, along with Andy Osho, who will also be signing her novel, Asking for a Friend. I say that because I want everybody to buy and read everyone's books, because this is so important to what we do in terms of sharing brilliant books and learning from others' experience. Nikesh, what is next for you?
I'm going to get a train home. I have a glass of... No, so, there's a couple of things I can't boringly talk about.
Oh, I always want to know that. Those things.
NDAs and stuff. But they're quite exciting. A couple of years ago, I started teaching at Faber Academy, and it's a brilliant place to teach, and I really love it. But I recognised that I had always been critical of how publishing hoovers up people who can afford to do courses like Faber Academy and the Curtis Brown one and MAs and all the rest of it. And so I was like, but I also need to pay my mortgage. So I thought, how can I give back? So basically every week, when I wrote up my lecture notes for what I'd be talking about that week, I just started posting them up on a free newsletter that went out to people, and I quickly gained a following. And my editor for Brown Baby basically asked me to turn them into a book. So I'm writing a book on writing. Oh, actually, I'm editing a badly written first draft of a book about writing. So I'm working on that, and I'm also working on a new YA book. So I write for teenagers. So I'm working on the third of a series of books that I'm writing about kids in Bristol, which is all about a young stand-up comedian, which I'm really excited about, because it's a return to comedy, which is going to be great. Although that's not announced yet. Sorry.
Don't tell anyone, please. Secret.
And also I'm setting up a bunch of creative writing projects with a bunch of young people in Bristol. So that's pretty much what I'm up to at the moment.
I mean, you are just so inspirational. I don't know how you do it all. You just told us you don't have time to write, and you're doing all these new things to give back even more. I mean, you never cease to amaze me, Nikesh. Thank you for being... The
one thing that my mum was really, she considered more important than everything else is there's this Hindi word, seva, which is like service to the community. And that's just something that she brought me and my sister up with, and I feel like the service I can do to the community can be the writing community, and so that's why I give back.
And we are so lucky to have you, so very lucky. I love that. What's the word?
Seva.
Going to remember that. We have a little time for questions that we might not want, but we are going to open it up. Does anyone have any questions? There is definitely a hand up lady here. I don't know quite. Yes, microphone on its way.
Hello, thank you all. Thank you so much for your talk, and I can't wait to read your book. I was going to ask, is there anything that's been written, sitcom, comedy or novel, that you wish you'd written? Is there one thing that if you could have written it, you would have loved to write it because you adore it?
I tell you what, if I could be in the writer's room for Succession, I feel like that would be, I'd take the rest of my life off. Or if I got the opportunity to write on the Amazing Spider-Man or Miles Morales Spider-Man comics, I think that would make me really happy. Like a couple of years ago, you know what, I'll just tell you because it's fine, no one cares. I had an interview to be in the writer's room for Miss Marvel, which is this new Marvel show, and I blew the interview really badly, and it was a real lesson to me. But my friend ended up show running that, and that is another show that I'd really love to write on. Miss Marvel's amazing, one of my favourite comic lines. But yeah, Succession, I love that show. I had a really funny conversation with Jesse Armstrong, who show runs it, because we were talking about we were talking about it and how much I love the show, and I was like, oh, can I be in the writers' room please? And he was like, well, no. and then I was like, and he said, would you really want to come and write on a show where it's just rich white people doing horrible things? I was like, who knows better how horrible rich white people can be? Alas, it didn't work out, but I love that show. I think it's amazing.
Oh, brilliant. I think there was somebody else who put the hand up, a lady at the back.
Nikesh, I have a question particularly around the memoir genre. So when, as writers, we're writing something that's so personal, but obviously the themes have got to be universal to then talk to other people. How do you balance that, where it's personal, not too self-indulgent, but at the same time universal? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, totally. I think the important thing to consider when you're writing a memoir is how is my story a cog in a wider theme? And I think most memoir writers start with like a central question, like what is the question I'm asking about the world that my own story can help to tell, because that stops us from, you know, putting absolutely everything onto the page and actually just sticking to the truth of the thing that we're wrestling with, like the wider thing, like. And you know, like when we teach fiction, we always talk about the difference between story and plot. And I think, story, like plot is what happens. Plot's what's like the action of the novel, but story is often what it's about. Like, what is the human experience? What is like the thematic journey for these characters? And I think you can apply that same logic to memoir writing as well. So if you know like the wider context in which your memoir exists, and like the big thematic journey that you want to take readers on, and your story just being the conduit for that, rather than your story. Like, I know this sort of sounds potentially like a mean way of thinking about it. Is like your personal story is like it's the construct for which we move through the book, rather than like the reason we're reading the book. If that makes sense. Hopefully that's helpful.
It's a really good answer. Any other questions from anybody? It's really hard to see. I don't think there are any other questions. But I know that Nikesh is going to go and sign copies of his book now in the Waterstones bookshop, so I'm sure we'll be happy to chat to you. As I said just a few minutes ago, Andy Osho will also be signing copies of Asking for Her Friend, her brilliant debut novel. I want to thank you all for joining us, but most importantly, I want to thank Nikesh for being so honest and generous and thoughtful with his comments today. I know that it's really important that we understand where we're at in terms of publishing, what we want to do and how we get there, and we need to learn from the experience of people who have been the forerunners for the change that we know we want to see. So Nikesh, thank you so much for being, as ever, truly inspirational and truly amazing.
No, thank you. And also get Emma Darby's book. It's really brilliant.
Yeah, it is.